The payment was supposed to go out that morning. The trucks were scheduled. The volunteers were ready. And hundreds of families were waiting for the help Margaret Whitlock had promised them. For 40 years, Margaret had built her foundation around one belief. If she gave people her word, she kept it. Until that morning, when she discovered the one thing she never thought she would find. Someone inside the foundation had made a decision she never approved. And that was why the situation felt impossible. Because Margaret Whitlock had spent 40 years building a foundation where promises were never taken lightly. That was why Sarah Bennett knew something was wrong the moment she saw the account report. She had checked the numbers 3 times before walking into Margaret Whitlock's office. At 70 years old, Margaret had learned that most problems announce themselves quietly before they became impossible to ignore. A missed phone call, a delayed report, or a conversation that suddenly became uncomfortable. But this was different. Sarah placed the folder on Margaret's desk. "Margaret, we have a problem." Margaret looked up from her paperwork. She immediately noticed Sarah's expression. "What happened?" Sarah opened the folder. "The payment for the storm recovery program cannot be released." Margaret looked confused. "The payment was already approved." "I know," Sarah said. "That's why this does not make sense. And I understand now that believing I could fix it does not change the fact that I should never have made that decision alone." "Then what is the issue?" Sarah hesitated. "The operating account does not have enough available funds." For a moment, the room was silent. Margaret looked at the documents in front of her. The reports were complete. The records were organized. The expenses were listed. Nothing looked broken. And yet, the money needed for the program was not there. Margaret slowly turned another page. "How much are we short?" Sarah gave her the number. Margaret did not react immediately. She simply looked at the report again. Because this was not just a financial problem. The storm recovery program had already been announced to the community. Local supporters had already committed their help. Families had already been told that assistance was coming. If the foundation delayed now, it would be the first time in 40 years that they failed to deliver on a promise. And Margaret Whitlock knew exactly what that would mean. People would not just remember a delayed payment. They would remember a broken promise. Outside the office, volunteers continued preparing supplies. Boxes were being filled. Clothing was being organized. School materials were being counted. Everyone believed the foundation was ready. They did not know that behind the office door, Margaret was facing a question she never expected to ask. Where had the money gone? Sarah watched Margaret carefully. "Do you think this is a mistake?" Margaret looked back at the report. "I hope it is." That answer stayed with Sarah. Because Margaret had spent 40 years building this foundation around trust. She knew people could make mistakes. She knew unexpected problems happened. But she also knew something else. Money did not disappear by accident. Not inside an organization that had survived for 4 decades. Someone had made a decision. The only question was why. Later that afternoon, Margaret walked through the foundation's main hallway. The walls were covered with photographs from years of community programs. Children receiving school supplies. Families getting support after difficult times. Volunteers standing together after long days of work. She stopped in front of the oldest photograph. A picture from the first year the foundation began. Back then, it was only a small group of neighbors trying to help people around them. No large office. No major recognition. Just people who believed their actions mattered. Margaret touched the edge of the frame. She wondered when things had started becoming more complicated. Because the missing money was only the first problem. Somewhere along the way, something inside the foundation had changed. And before Margaret could protect its future, she had to understand its past. Margaret Whitlock did not begin her investigation by looking for someone to blame. She began by looking for answers. The next morning, she arrived at the foundation before most of the volunteers. The building was quiet. The lights in the hallway were still off. The familiar sounds of people preparing programs had not started yet. For years, Margaret had loved this part of the day. The peaceful moments before everything became busy. But that morning, the quiet felt different. She walked into her office and placed the financial report on the desk. The same report she had reviewed the night before. The same numbers. The same unanswered question. Where had the money gone? Sarah Bennett arrived shortly after. She carried another folder. I pulled the records from the last 6 months, Sarah said. Margaret nodded. Good. Let's start there. They spent the next several hours reviewing every detail. The payments. The approvals. The program expenses. At first, everything appeared normal. The foundation had not suddenly stopped operating. Bills had been paid. Programs had continued. Volunteers had received what they needed. That was what made the situation confusing. There was no obvious mistake. No missing document. No simple explanation. But Margaret noticed something else. The foundation had changed. Not in one dramatic moment. Not because of one decision. It was a series of small changes that happened over time. Sarah pointed to a list of names. These are volunteers who stepped away during the last year. Margaret looked down. Some names were familiar. Very familiar. People who had spent years helping the foundation. People who understood the mission. People who had once been part of every major program. Did they leave because of the financial issue? Margaret asked. Sarah shook her head. No. Most of them left before this happened. That answer made Margaret pause. Because it meant the missing money was not the beginning. It was only the moment when everyone finally noticed something was wrong. That afternoon, Margaret and Sarah met with one of the former volunteers. Her name was Linda Parker. Linda had volunteered with the foundation for nearly 20 years. She knew the organization from the inside. She knew the people. She knew the history. When she saw Margaret, she smiled warmly. I'm glad you called, Linda said. Margaret looked surprised. Why? Because I was worried nobody would ask why people were leaving. The answer stayed in the air. Margaret leaned forward. What do you mean? Linda explained that she still respected the foundation. She still cared about the families. She still wanted the mission to succeed. But over time, she felt something had changed. It used to feel like everyone was building this together, Linda said. Now, sometimes it feels like people are just being informed about decisions after they are already made. Margaret listened carefully. She did not interrupt. Because she knew the most dangerous problems inside an organization were not always the loud ones. Sometimes they were the quiet ones. The moments when people stopped sharing ideas. When experienced volunteers stopped speaking up. When people who cared simply decided to step away. Before leaving, Linda added one more thing. I don't think anyone wanted to hurt the foundation. Margaret looked at her. Then what do you think happened? Linda thought for a moment. I think somewhere along the way, people became so focused on moving forward that they forgot to ask if everyone was moving together. On the drive back, Margaret looked out the window. The missing money was still a problem. But now there was another question. Who had changed the foundation's direction, and why? Margaret Whitlock had spent most of her life believing that people revealed their true feelings through their actions. Not through what they promised. Not through what they said in meetings. But through what they continued to do when nobody was watching. That was why Linda Parker's words stayed with her. The missing money was serious. But the changes inside the foundation might have started long before the account problem appeared. The next few days, Margaret and Sarah Bennett continued reaching out to former volunteers. They did not ask for rumors. They did not ask people to criticize anyone. They simply asked one question. What happened? The answers were not identical. But they had something in common. Many people said they still believed in the foundation. They still believed in the mission. They still cared about helping families. They just no longer felt connected to the decisions being made. One former volunteer explained that meetings had changed. Years ago, people gathered around a table and discussed ideas together. Everyone had a chance to speak. Everyone understood why decisions were made. Recently, some volunteers felt they were only hearing the final results. They were still part of the work. But they no longer felt like they were part of the direction. Margaret listened carefully. Because she understood something about organizations. People rarely leave because of one moment. Usually, they leave after many small moments. A missed conversation. A question that was never answered. A feeling that their experience no longer mattered. Later that week, Sarah found another piece of information. A list of internal changes made over the previous year. She placed it on Margaret's desk. I compared the timing, Sarah said. Margaret looked through the pages. The changes were not unusual by themselves. New procedures. Different reporting methods. Updated approval steps. Any growing organization needed some changes. But Sarah pointed to the dates. Most of these changes happened around the same time. Margaret looked up. The same time as what? The time when many longtime volunteers started stepping away. For several seconds, neither woman spoke. Because now they were seeing a pattern. Not proof. Not yet. But a pattern. Someone had changed how the foundation operated. And those changes had affected more than paperwork. They had affected people. That evening, Margaret stayed late at the office. The hallway was empty. The lights from the volunteer room were already turned off. She walked past the photographs on the wall. Each picture represented a different chapter of the foundation's history. A food drive. A school supply event. A neighborhood gathering. Thousands of moments created by thousands of people. Margaret stopped beside one photograph from 20 years earlier. She remembered everyone in that picture. Some were still involved. Some had moved away. Some had quietly disappeared. She wondered how many people had left without anyone asking why. The following morning, Sarah came into her office with another folder. This time, her expression was different. Margaret, I found something about the financial changes. Margaret looked up. What kind of changes? Sarah opened the folder. There are several transactions that were approved through a newer process. Margaret studied the documents. Who created that process? Sarah hesitated. Then she answered. Someone who helped redesign the approval process. Margaret looked at the document again. Who? Sarah slowly turned the page. And Margaret saw the signature. Ryan Mercer. The same person Margaret had trusted to help build the foundation's future. The name changed the atmosphere in the room. Not because Margaret suddenly believed Ryan was responsible. But because Ryan was connected to both stories. The changes inside the foundation. And the missing money. Margaret closed the folder slowly. Ryan had joined the foundation to help it grow. He had brought new ideas. New energy. New connections. But now, the same person who helped move the foundation forward might also hold the answers to why it had changed. Margaret looked at Sarah. We need to talk to him. Because before she made any judgment, she needed to understand one thing. Was Ryan the reason the foundation was in trouble? Or was he only the person standing closest to a problem that had been growing for years? Ryan Mercer had never imagined that one day his name would become part of a difficult conversation inside the foundation. For 7 years, he had worked to help the organization grow. When he first arrived, Margaret Whitlock saw something valuable in him. Ryan understood how the world was changing. He knew younger generations connected differently. He knew communities were becoming more dependent on digital communication. And he believed the foundation could help more people if it found new ways to reach them. Margaret agreed. The foundation had a long history. But she also knew that history alone could not carry an organization forever. It needed people who could build the next chapter. Ryan became one of those people. He helped create new outreach programs. He encouraged younger volunteers to participate. He helped the foundation become more visible in the community. Many people respected him for that. Margaret still remembered one afternoon when Ryan stayed after everyone left. A young volunteer had made a mistake during a community event, and Ryan spent nearly an hour helping her fix it. That was the person Margaret knew. Someone who wanted people to succeed. But Margaret also remembered something else. Ryan always believed speed could solve problems. Sometimes, he trusted his own judgment before he trusted the process. That was why Margaret felt something she did not expect when Sarah mentioned his name. Not anger. Not disappointment. Concern. Because if Ryan was connected to the problem, then the situation was more complicated than anyone wanted it to be. The next morning, Margaret asked Ryan to meet with her. When he walked into the office, he noticed the seriousness immediately. Usually, conversations with Margaret were about future ideas. New projects. Ways to expand the foundation's impact. This time, a folder was waiting on the desk. Ryan sat down. Is everything okay? Margaret looked at him carefully. I hope you can help us understand something. Sarah placed the documents in front of him. These are some recent changes to our financial procedures. Ryan looked through the pages. Margaret watched his reaction. Not because she was trying to catch him. Because she wanted to understand him. After several moments, Ryan closed the folder. I know what this is about. That answer surprised Sarah. You do? Ryan nodded slowly. I knew questions would eventually come up. Margaret leaned forward. Why? Ryan looked down at the documents. Because I changed the process. The room became quiet. Margaret remained calm. What was your reason? Ryan explained that when he joined the foundation, he noticed that some decisions moved slowly. Sometimes, opportunities came and went because approvals took too long. He believed the organization needed a faster way to respond. So he helped create a more streamlined process. A process that allowed fewer steps. Fewer delays. Faster decisions. Margaret listened. Part of her understood his thinking. A growing organization did need to adapt. But she also understood something else. Speed could be useful. But speed without enough oversight could create problems. Ryan, Margaret said, did anyone else review these changes before they were put in place? Ryan paused. That pause told her more than his answer. Not in the way it should have been. Sarah looked at the documents again. This was not only about money anymore. It was about how decisions were being made. Ryan looked at Margaret. I was trying to help the foundation. Margaret believed him. That was what made this harder. Because she was not sitting across from someone who wanted the organization to fail. She was sitting across from someone who believed he was helping. But good intentions did not always protect people from bad outcomes. After the meeting, Margaret and Sarah reviewed the information again. Ryan had confirmed that he changed the process. But he had not explained everything. There was still one unanswered question. The new process explained how decisions could happen faster. But it did not explain why the operating account was missing money. Margaret closed the folder. Sarah, we are getting closer. Sarah nodded. But we still do not know the whole story. Margaret looked at the documents on the desk. And she realized something important. The foundation's problem was not just about one person. It was about a system that had changed quietly. Until one morning, everyone finally noticed. Margaret Whitlock had spent decades learning how to recognize the difference between a mistake and a warning sign. A mistake could happen once. A warning sign usually appeared more than once. And as she reviewed the foundation's recent records, she began to notice something that bothered her. The missing money was not the only unusual thing. The way decisions were being made had changed too. The next morning, Margaret and Sarah Bennett continued their review. They compared old procedures with the newer ones Ryan had helped introduce. The differences were clear. In the past, major decisions often involved several conversations. People from different areas of the foundation shared their opinions. Questions were encouraged. Concerns were discussed before action was taken. The newer process was faster, more efficient. But it also placed more responsibility in fewer hands. Sarah pointed to one section of the documents. This approval method was introduced last year. Margaret looked closer. Who signed off on it? Sarah checked the record. Ryan. Margaret nodded slowly. Again, she did not feel anger. She felt concern. Because she understood why someone would want to make things easier. She had spent years watching volunteers struggle with slow processes. She knew that too many delays could prevent people from receiving help when they needed it. But she also knew something else. A system should not depend on one person always making the perfect decision. That was not how a strong organization worked. Later that afternoon, Margaret and Sarah met with another former volunteer. Her name was Karen Mitchell. Karen had been part of the foundation for 15 years. She had organized events, trained new volunteers, helped coordinate community programs. When Margaret asked why she stepped away, Karen gave an answer that was different from Linda's. But the feeling behind it was the same. I didn't leave because I stopped believing in the work, Karen said. I left because I felt like the foundation was becoming something I no longer recognized. Margaret listened carefully. What do you mean? Karen explained that she understood change was necessary. She supported new ideas. She wanted younger volunteers involved. She wanted the foundation to grow. But growth should not make people feel invisible, Karen said. Those words stayed with Margaret. Because that was the part nobody had been talking about. The foundation was still successful on the outside. Programs were still running. The community still respected the organization. But inside, some people felt disconnected. That evening, Sarah reviewed the financial records again. This time, she focused on the timing. She compared the dates of the new procedures with the financial activity around the operating account. Then she stopped. Margaret. Something in Sarah's voice made Margaret look up. What did you find? Sarah turned the screen toward her. These account movements happened after the new approval process was created. Margaret studied the information. The dates matched. The process changed. Then the financial decisions changed. But there was still something missing. A reason. A motive. An explanation. Sarah looked at Margaret. Do you think Ryan knew this could happen? Margaret did not answer immediately. Because that was the question she had been avoiding. Ryan had changed the system. Ryan was connected to the account activity. But Ryan was also the person who had spent 7 years trying to help the foundation succeed. Margaret closed the laptop. We need facts before conclusions. Sarah nodded. But both women understood what had changed. They were no longer investigating only a financial problem. They were investigating a decision that had affected the entire foundation. And somewhere inside those decisions was the answer they still needed to find. What happened to the money? And why did Ryan believe he had the right to make that choice? Margaret Whitlock had spent years teaching others that trust was built through actions. Not promises. Not titles. Not good intentions. Actions. That was why the information in front of her felt so difficult to accept. Because every path they followed seemed to lead back to the same person. Ryan Mercer. But Margaret refused to make a decision based only on suspicion. She needed the full picture. The next morning, Sarah Bennett continued reviewing the financial records. This time, she focused on the operating account. The account that was supposed to support programs like the Storm Recovery Project. After several hours, Sarah found something that made her stop. Margaret, I think I found the issue. Margaret walked over to her desk. Sarah pointed to the transaction history. These transfers were not listed as expenses. Margaret looked closely. What were they listed as? Temporary movements between accounts. Margaret studied the dates. The transfers were recorded. The information was not hidden. But something about it still bothered her. Who authorized them? Sarah checked the records. Ryan. Margaret slowly sat down. She expected to feel anger. Instead, she felt something heavier. Disappointment. Because she remembered Ryan's first years at the foundation. She remembered him staying late to finish projects. She remembered him visiting community partners. She remembered how excited he was when the foundation reached people who had never heard about their work before. That history mattered. But so did responsibility. Margaret looked at Sarah. We need to speak with him again. This time, the conversation was different. Ryan entered the office knowing what they wanted to discuss. He did not look surprised. He looked tired. Margaret placed the documents on the table. Ryan, we need you to explain these transfers. For a few seconds, Ryan said nothing. Then he nodded. I knew this conversation was coming. Sarah watched him carefully. Why? Ryan looked down. Because I made a decision I thought I could fix. The room became quiet. He explained that several months earlier, his personal business had faced a temporary financial challenge. He believed it would be resolved quickly. He believed he could solve the situation before it affected anyone. So he moved money temporarily, thinking he would replace it soon. Margaret listened without interrupting. She wanted to understand. Not because she accepted the decision. But because she needed to know how someone she trusted reached that point. When did you plan to return the money? Sarah asked. Ryan answered honestly. Within a short period of time. But you didn't. Ryan lowered his eyes. No. Margaret took a slow breath. Ryan, do you understand why this cannot happen? He nodded. Yes. This foundation is responsible for resources that belong to the community, Margaret said. It does not matter whether someone intends to correct a mistake later. The decision itself affects trust. Ryan did not argue. I know. And that was what made the situation more complicated. He was not denying what happened. He was not blaming someone else. He knew he had crossed a line. But Margaret still had questions. Because one answer was clear now. Ryan had moved the money. But another question remained. Why had the foundation system allowed one person to make that decision without anyone noticing? After Ryan left, Sarah looked at Margaret. Do you think he meant to harm the foundation? Margaret looked toward the hallway. No. She paused. But I think he believed caring about something gave him permission to decide alone. That was the moment Margaret understood. The missing money was not the only problem. The real problem was deeper. Somewhere along the way, the foundation had confused trust with control. And now Margaret had to decide how to repair both. Margaret Whitlock had finally learned what happened to the money. But she also understood something important. Finding the answer was not the same as solving the problem. The foundation had spent 40 years building trust with the community. That trust could not be repaired by simply returning funds or correcting paperwork. People needed to know that the foundation had learned from what happened. And before Margaret could decide what came next, she needed to understand one more thing. How did Ryan Mercer, someone who cared deeply about the mission, reach a point where he believed this decision was acceptable? The next morning, Margaret asked Ryan to meet with her again. This time, Sarah Bennett joined them. There were no accusations. No raised voices. Only questions that needed honest answers. Margaret placed the documents on the table. Ryan, we know what happened with the account. Ryan nodded. I understand. Sarah looked at him. We need to understand the full timeline. Ryan took a breath. Then he explained everything. Several months earlier, his business had experienced a difficult period. It was not something he expected. It was not something he planned for. He convinced himself the situation would be temporary. He told himself he was only borrowing time. But he failed to understand one thing. The moment he used someone else's trust to solve his own problem, the damage had already begun. He believed he could handle it quickly. And because he had spent years working with the Foundation's operations, he convinced himself that he understood the consequences. That was where he made the mistake. Ryan admitted that he moved funds from the Foundation temporarily, believing he could return them before the organization needed them. But the timing did not work out the way he expected. The money was not restored before the storm recovery program needed to begin. Margaret listened quietly. Because the details mattered. The reason mattered. But so did the impact. Ryan, Margaret said, what would have happened if we had not discovered this? Ryan looked down. I don't know. That answer was honest. And Margaret appreciated that. But it also showed him something he had not fully considered. A decision could create consequences even when someone believed they had control of the situation. Sarah asked another question. Why didn't you tell anyone? Ryan was silent for a moment. Then he answered. Because I thought I could fix it before anyone needed to know. Margaret looked at him. And there it was. The real problem. Not only the money. Not only the decision. But the belief that one person could carry a serious responsibility alone. After the meeting, Margaret walked through the Foundation's main room. Volunteers were preparing supplies for the storm program. They did not know every detail of what had happened. They only knew the work needed to continue. Margaret watched them organize boxes and prepare materials. She thought about the people who built this foundation. They never believed one person was responsible for everything. They built it together. That was the lesson Ryan had forgotten. And perhaps, in some ways, the foundation itself had forgotten too. Later that afternoon, Sarah reviewed the updated information. Margaret, we know what Ryan did. Margaret nodded. Yes. But we still need to answer another question. Margaret looked at her. What question? Sarah closed the folder. How did our system allow this to happen? Margaret looked back at the office around her. The missing money was no longer the only problem. The real challenge was rebuilding a foundation where trust and accountability could exist together. Because a strong organization was not one where people never made mistakes. It was one where mistakes could be faced before they became something bigger. Margaret Whitlock thought the hardest part would be discovering what happened. She was wrong. The hardest part was understanding why it happened. Because the truth about Ryan Mercer was not simple. He had made a serious decision without proper approval. He had placed the foundation at risk. But he was also the person who had spent 7 years helping the organization grow. And Margaret knew that both things could be true at the same time. A person could do meaningful work and still make a harmful choice. That was why she did not want the foundation to react with emotion. It needed to respond with wisdom. Over the next several days, Margaret and Sarah Bennett focused on repairing the immediate damage. The funds needed to be restored. The storm recovery program needed to continue. And new financial safeguards needed to be created. But while reviewing the Foundation's procedures, they discovered something that changed the way they viewed the entire situation. The problem did not begin with Ryan moving the money. It began earlier. Sarah found several examples of decisions that had gradually moved away from the Foundation's original process. Not because anyone wanted to break the rules. Not because people stopped caring. But because the organization had grown quickly, and the systems had not grown with it. Margaret looked through the documents carefully. For years, the Foundation had relied on something powerful. Trust. People trusted each other. Volunteers trusted leaders. Leaders trusted experienced team members. And most of the time, that trust had helped the Foundation succeed. But Margaret realized something important. Trust was never supposed to replace responsibility. It was supposed to work together with responsibility. For the first time in 40 years, Margaret wondered if the culture she had created had depended too much on personal trust and not enough on protection. That afternoon, Margaret asked Sarah to meet with several longtime volunteers. She wanted them to hear directly from the people who had built the foundation. One volunteer, David Collins, shared a thought that stayed with Margaret. When this organization started, everyone knew each other's roles because there were only a few of us. He looked around the room. But as we grew, we needed more structure. We just did not realize how important that was until now. Margaret nodded. Because that was exactly what she was beginning to understand. The foundation had not failed because people stopped caring. It had struggled because caring alone was not enough. A strong mission needed strong systems. Later that evening, Margaret met with Ryan one more time. This conversation was different from the others. There was no need to discuss what happened. They both knew. Instead, Margaret asked him a different question. Ryan, if you could go back, what would you change? Ryan thought carefully. I would ask for help sooner. Margaret looked at him. Why didn't you? Ryan gave a quiet answer. Because I thought admitting I needed help meant I was failing. That response surprised her. Not because it justified what he did. It did not. But because it revealed something human. Ryan had not trusted the system. And maybe he had not trusted the people around him enough either. Before leaving, Ryan looked at Margaret. I know I damaged people's trust. Margaret nodded. Yes. He accepted that answer. Then Margaret continued. But what happens next matters too. Ryan looked up. Are you saying there is still a place for me here? Margaret paused. The foundation needs people who understand the mission. But it also needs people who understand accountability. Ryan nodded slowly. For the first time, Margaret saw something different. Not the confident leader who always wanted to solve problems. But someone who finally understood that leadership was not about carrying everything alone. It was about knowing when to let others help carry it with you. And Margaret knew the next decision would shape the future of the foundation. Not only what happened to Ryan, but who would lead the organization into the years ahead. Margaret Whitlock knew the foundation had reached a turning point. The money had been found. The decision behind it had been understood. But the future was still uncertain. Because now the foundation had to answer a difficult question. What should happen when someone who made a serious mistake was also someone who had given years of meaningful service? The board meeting was scheduled for Friday morning. Everyone arrived knowing the conversation would not be easy. This was not simply about Ryan Mercer. It was about the values the foundation had protected for 40 years. The meeting began with a review of what happened. The funds would be returned. The financial procedures would be changed. New oversight would be created. But the biggest discussion was about Ryan's role. Some board members believed Ryan should step away completely. They believed that someone responsible for a major decision involving foundation resources could no longer hold a position of influence. Their concern was understandable. Trust was not something that could be repaired with words alone. Other members looked at the situation differently. They remembered Ryan's years of work. They remembered the programs he helped create. They remembered the people he brought into the foundation. They believed the mistake was serious, but they also believed the foundation should consider the person behind it. One board member looked at Margaret. I respect Ryan. But respect cannot replace accountability. Margaret listened to every opinion. She did not rush to defend Ryan. And she did not rush to remove him. Because she knew leadership required something more difficult than choosing the easiest answer. It required choosing the right answer. Finally, Margaret spoke. We cannot pretend this did not happen. Everyone became quiet. Ryan made a decision that should not have been made. The process failed, and we need to acknowledge that. She paused. But we also need to ask ourselves what kind of organization we want to be. Margaret looked around the room. Do we want a foundation that only knows how to respond when everything goes right? No. Or do we want a foundation that knows how to face problems honestly and become stronger because of them? The room remained silent. But everyone understood her point. Accountability mattered. So did growth. The board agreed on several changes. Ryan would no longer hold the same leadership responsibilities. He would not have independent authority over major financial decisions. The foundation would create stronger review procedures. Important choices would require more than one person's approval. The system had to become stronger than any individual. When Margaret later explained the decision to Ryan, he listened carefully. "I understand," he said. Margaret looked at him. "I know this is difficult." Ryan nodded. "It should be." That answer stayed with her. Because months earlier, Ryan had believed solving the problem quickly was more important than following the process. Now he understood something different. The process existed because the mission mattered. Not because people were expected to be perfect. Because people were human. Before leaving, Ryan asked one question. "Do you still believe I can help this foundation?" Margaret thought for a moment. "Yes." Ryan looked surprised. "But your role has to change." He nodded. "I understand." For the first time in weeks, Margaret felt a small sense of relief. Not because everything was fixed. Not because the difficult part was over. But because the foundation had made an important choice. It chose honesty over silence. It chose responsibility over convenience. And now, one final question remained. Who would carry the foundation into its next 40 years? Margaret Whitlock had spent the last 40 years protecting one simple idea. A foundation was not built by one person. It was built by people who believed in the same purpose. And now, as she looked toward the future, she knew the foundation needed something it had never needed before. A new kind of leadership. Not someone who would simply continue what she had done. Someone who understood why it mattered. For several weeks, Margaret quietly watched Sarah Bennett. She watched how Sarah handled difficult conversations. How she listened to volunteers. How she responded when people disagreed. Margaret was not searching for someone who had all the answers. She was searching for someone who understood that leadership was not about having the loudest voice in the room. It was about creating a room where people felt comfortable speaking. One afternoon, Margaret asked Sarah to join her in the old conference room. The same room where hundreds of decisions had been made over the years. The walls were covered with photographs from past programs. Community events. Volunteer gatherings. Families receiving support. Margaret placed a small notebook on the table. The edges were worn from years of use. Sarah recognized it immediately. "That is from the early days, isn't it?" Margaret smiled. "Yes." Inside were handwritten notes from the foundation's first meetings. Simple ideas. Simple goals. Help people. Work together. Stay connected to the community. Margaret looked at Sarah. "Do you know what I think we lost for a while?" Sarah waited. "We became so focused on growing that we forgot growth only matters if people still feel connected to the mission." Sarah nodded. "I think people want to feel that their work matters." Exactly. That was the quality Margaret saw in Sarah. She did not talk about changing everything. She talked about understanding what already existed. Over the following weeks, Sarah began taking on more responsibilities. But she started differently than Ryan had. She listened first. She met with long-time volunteers. She asked what they believed the foundation did well. She asked what needed improvement. She invited people who had stepped away to share their experiences. And slowly, something began to return. People started speaking more openly. Volunteers who had been quiet began sharing ideas again. The foundation did not feel like it was being rebuilt from the ground up. It felt like it was finding its balance. Margaret noticed the difference. One evening, she watched Sarah speak with a group of volunteers preparing supplies for another community program. Sarah was not standing in front of them giving instructions. She was standing among them. Listening. Helping. Learning. And Margaret realized she had made the right choice. But there was still one important step. Ryan. Because if the foundation was going to move forward, Margaret knew everyone needed clarity about his future. She did not want Ryan to disappear from the story. That would ignore the years of work he had contributed. But she also knew the foundation could not return to the way things were before. The new chapter required a different role for him. A role built around experience. Not control. The next morning, Margaret invited Ryan back to her office. She had one question for him. Ryan, are you willing to help build a foundation that does not depend on one person having all the answers? Ryan thought for a long moment. Then he smiled slightly. Yes. And Margaret knew that answer mattered more than any title. Because sometimes the strongest leaders are not the ones who hold on to their position. They are the ones who learn how to support what comes after them. Ryan Mercer knew that returning to the foundation would feel different. And he was right. The same building was there. The same hallways. The same photographs on the walls. But something had changed. Not because people were against him. Because everyone understood that the foundation had entered a new chapter. For years, Ryan had been one of the people leading the way. He was the person with new ideas. The person looking for new opportunities. The person encouraging the organization to grow. Now, his role was different. And accepting that difference was not easy. But Ryan also understood something he had not understood before. The foundation's mission was bigger than his reputation. Bigger than his ideas. Bigger than his desire to solve problems quickly. The first few weeks were quiet. Ryan worked closely with Sarah Bennett. But this time, he approached things differently. He asked more questions. He listened longer. He waited before offering solutions. Sarah noticed the change. One afternoon, while reviewing plans for an upcoming community program, she looked at him and smiled. You know, you used to answer questions before people finished asking them. Ryan laughed softly. I know. What changed? Ryan looked at the documents in front of him. I realized I was trying so hard to be useful that I forgot being useful also means knowing when to listen. Sarah appreciated that answer. Because she knew rebuilding trust was not about one conversation. It was about consistent actions over time. Meanwhile, Margaret watched the foundation slowly recover. The storm relief program was completed successfully. Families received the support they needed. Volunteers felt more involved. New procedures were introduced. Important financial decisions were reviewed more carefully. But the biggest change was not written in any document. It was something people could feel. People were talking again. They were sharing ideas. They were asking questions. The foundation was becoming a place where people felt responsible for the mission, not just responsible for their own tasks. One evening, Margaret stayed late at the office. She walked through the empty building one more time. She passed the old photographs. The first volunteers. The early programs. The moments that shaped the foundation. Then she stopped near the conference room. That was where everything had changed. The difficult conversations. The uncomfortable questions. The decisions nobody wanted to make. But Margaret realized something. Those moments did not weaken the foundation. They revealed what the foundation truly valued. Honesty. Responsibility. The willingness to improve. The next morning, Margaret met with Sarah and Ryan together. She wanted one final conversation before she officially stepped further away from daily leadership. I want both of you to remember something, Margaret said. This foundation survived because people cared enough to tell the truth, even when the truth was difficult. Sarah nodded. Ryan listened carefully. Margaret continued. Leadership is not about never making mistakes. It is about creating a place where mistakes can be recognized, corrected, and learned from. Ryan looked down. He knew those words were meant for him. But he also knew they applied to everyone. Including Margaret. Because she had learned something too. A leader could spend years building something strong. But eventually, the greatest responsibility was not holding on. It was trusting others to continue the work. As Margaret looked at Sarah, she saw the future of the foundation. As she looked at Ryan, she saw someone who had learned a difficult lesson. And for the first time in months, she felt peace. The foundation was no longer depending on one person. It was becoming what it was always meant to be. A community built by many people. And protected by many hearts. Margaret Whitlock never expected the final lesson of her 40-year journey to be about letting go. For most of her life, she believed protecting the foundation meant staying close to every decision. Checking every detail. Making sure nothing was overlooked. And for many years, that approach helped the foundation survive. But after everything that happened, Margaret understood something she had not fully accepted before. A foundation built on trust could not depend on one person forever. It needed people who were willing to carry the mission together. Months after the financial crisis, the storm recovery program became a memory that the community would remember for a different reason. Not because it almost failed. But because it showed what happened when people chose honesty over silence. The supplies reached the families who needed them. The volunteers completed the work they had promised. The community saw that the foundation kept its commitment. And behind the scenes, the organization had changed. Not by becoming something completely new. By becoming stronger. Sarah Bennett officially stepped into her leadership role. She did not try to copy Margaret. She understood that every generation brought something different. Instead of making decisions alone, Sarah built conversations. She invited volunteers to share their ideas. She created clearer systems. She made sure people understood not only what decisions were made, but why they were made. The foundation became more open. More connected. More prepared for the future. Ryan Mercer continued working with the organization as an advisor. His role was different now. And he accepted that. He no longer saw leadership as being the person with the fastest answer. He saw it as helping others make better decisions. One afternoon, Margaret watched Ryan and Sarah preparing a new community program together. She noticed something that would have been impossible months earlier. They were not competing. They were not trying to prove who was right. They were working toward the same goal. Helping people. Margaret smiled. Because that was the future she had hoped for. Not a foundation without problems. Not a foundation where nobody ever made mistakes. A foundation where people were willing to face problems, learn from them, and continue moving forward. Later that week, Margaret returned to the office one final time. She walked slowly through the hallway. The photographs on the walls reminded her of everyone who had been part of the journey. The first volunteers. The families helped over the years. The people who gave their time when nobody was watching. She stopped in front of the oldest photograph. 40 years earlier, the foundation had started with a simple belief. That ordinary people could create something meaningful when they worked together. Margaret realized that belief had never changed. Only the people carrying it had changed. And that was exactly how it was supposed to be. A true legacy was not something that depended on one person staying forever. A true legacy was something strong enough to continue after that person stepped aside. Margaret had not lost the foundation she built. She had finally seen what it had become. Something bigger than herself. Something protected by many people. Because the strongest legacy is never what one person leaves behind. It is what continues when others are ready to carry it forward. Disclaimer. This story is fictional and created for entertainment purposes. The characters, organizations, and events are fictional. Any similarities to real people or events are purely coincidental.